The world called her the most beautiful woman in London, the American who married into a dukedom and bewitched a prince. But behind the jewels and the famous name, her husband was rotting from the inside, dying by slow inches of a disease no one in polite society would say aloud, while she rode out to meet the men the gossips counted by the hundred. One of those men would wear a crown. Another would break her heart on the far side of the world, while she sat beside that husband's deathbed. And the small boy who watched it all, starved of her attention, would grow up to save his country and to call her, without bitterness, more like a sister than a mother. They would remember the scandal for 100 years. What did it cost the woman underneath to earn it? If these are the kinds of lives the official histories smooth over, then subscribe and stay close, because the truth of this woman was buried under her own legend, and it deserves to be told in full. Chapter 1. The American Girl Who Unsettled London. She arrived in a city that had no idea what to do with her, and within a season, the most powerful men in England could not look away. Jennie Jerome, known from childhood as Jennie, was born in Brooklyn on the 9th of January 1854, the second of 3 surviving daughters of a man who made and lost fortunes the way other men changed their coats. Her father was Leonard Jerome, a Wall Street speculator the newspapers called the King of Wall Street, a part owner of one of New York's great papers, a builder of racecourses, a keeper of opera singers, and a gambler on a scale that left his family rich one year and anxious the next. He was new money in a country that still bowed to old, and his daughters grew up inside the swing of his fortunes, learning early that grandeur could arrive and vanish on the turn of a market. There was nothing settled about Jennie's childhood, and nothing provincial either. Her mother, Clara, ambitious for her girls and impatient with the snobberies of New York society, took the 3 daughters to Europe in the late 1860s. They lived first in Paris, in the last glittering years of the Second Empire, the court of Napoleon III, where Jennie absorbed the manners, the French, and the music that would mark her for the rest of her life. She was a serious pianist, trained to a level that astonished the professionals who later heard her play, and in a different century and a different body, she might have made a career of it. When the empire fell in 1870 and the Prussians closed on Paris, the family crossed to London, and it was there, on the edges of a society that prized blood above money and reticence above brilliance, that Jennie came of age. What people remembered first was the way she looked. The descriptions that survive strain after something they cannot quite hold. Dark hair, a vivid colouring her contemporaries put down to her mother's part French ancestry. Eyes that seemed to hold a private joke. The diplomat Lord Davenant left the most famous account of all, written after he watched her enter a room years later. There was more of the panther than of the woman in her look, he wrote, more of the cat than of the lady in the way she moved. It was not the description anyone gave of a well-behaved Victorian wife. It was the description of a force. And there was the detail the drawing rooms whispered about, the small mark she carried on her own skin. On her right wrist, just where a bracelet might sit, Jennie wore a tattoo of a coiled snake. In an age when respectable women did not mark their bodies at all, it was an extraordinary thing for the daughter of an ambitious family to carry, and she dealt with it in the most Jennie way imaginable. She covered it with a band of diamonds and let people wonder. The snake stayed with her all her life, hidden under the jewels, the private truth beneath the public surface, and it is as good an emblem as any for the woman who wore it. Consider what she was, set against the world she had entered. London society in the 1870s was a closed system. A few thousand families who knew one another's grandparents, who married within a narrow circle, and who regarded an American, however rich, as a kind of bright and slightly alarming import. The great aristocratic houses commanded estates of tens of thousands of acres, staffs of servants numbering into the hundreds, and a confidence so total it never needed to raise its voice. Into this, Jennie came with no title, no ancient name, and a father whose fortune might evaporate before the wedding breakfast was cleared. What she had instead was beauty, nerve, intelligence, and an absolute refusal to apologize for any of the three. It was not nearly enough to make her safe. It was more than enough to make her dangerous. Consider the swing of the fortune that had carried her there. In his best years, Leonard Jerome was reckoned to be worth millions of dollars, a fortune that in the money of today would run into the tens of millions, built on bold plays in railway shares and gold and the wild markets of the American Civil War. He spent it as fast as he made it, on a private theatre seating hundreds in his New York mansion, on a stable of trotting horses, on the celebrated singers he liked to keep near him. Then a market would turn against him, and the whole edifice would shudder, the money draining away until the next great gamble refilled it. Jennie grew up watching grandeur arrive and vanish and arrive again, and the lessons sank deep. Money was for spending, position was for seizing, and the safe, cautious, hoarding life was for other people. She would live by that creed and run up the debts of it until the day she died. By the summer of 1873, she was 19 years old, fluent in 3 languages, a musician of near professional gift, and the most striking young woman in any room she entered. She was also, though she did not yet know it, 3 days away from the decision that would shape the rest of her life, and the lives of men not yet born. The world was about to find out what to do with the American girl. The answer was that it would never quite manage it. Chapter 2. 3 days to a wedding. They met at a summer ball by the sea, and within 3 days they had decided to spend their lives together before either family could stop them. The place was Cowes, on the Isle of Wight, in the first week of August, 1873, during the regatta week that drew the whole of fashionable England to the water. Jennie was there with her mother and sisters. Across the room was a slight, intense young man with prominent eyes and an enormous moustache, the second son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough. His name was Lord Randolph Churchill, and he was 24 years old. What happened between them happened fast, and on this the accounts agree. They talked through that first evening. Within a day or two, Randolph had told a friend that he meant to marry the dark one, the second Miss Jerome. Within 3 days of meeting he had proposed, and Jennie had accepted. It was not a courtship in any sense the age recognized. It was a collision. 2 clever, headstrong, impatient young people, recognizing something in each other and refusing to wait for permission. The permission, as it turned out, would be a long time coming. Both families were appalled, and for mirror image reasons. The Duke of Marlborough looked at the Jeromes and saw exactly what an old English dynasty feared most: loud American money with no pedigree behind it. A speculator father whose fortune was a rumour and whose name meant nothing. He had hoped his son would marry land and lineage. Instead, the boy had attached himself, in under a week, to a New York financier's daughter. Leonard Jerome, for his part, was no more pleased to be condescended to by a duke who needed his money more than he admitted. The result was nearly a year of hard, unromantic negotiation, conducted by lawyers, over how much an American father would pay to place his daughter inside a British aristocratic family that did not want her. The money fight was bitter, and it is worth dwelling on, because it tells you everything about the world Jennie was marrying into. An aristocratic marriage in Victorian England was a property transaction dressed in white. The bride brought a settlement, a capital sum, and the income from it passed, by long custom, into her husband's control. The wife herself, under the law as it then stood, owned almost nothing once she married. Her money became his. Leonard Jerome, a self-made American who had watched his daughters grow up clever and capable, found this arrangement intolerable. He eventually agreed to settle £50,000, a sum worth something close to £5 million in the money of today, yielding about £2,000 a year. But he attached a condition that scandalized the Marlborough lawyers. 1,000 of that 2,000 a year, he insisted, must be settled on Jennie herself as her own money to do with as she pleased. In England, in 1874, that simply was not done. A wife with independent income of her own was a near-revolutionary idea, and the Married Women's Property Acts that would slowly change the law were only beginning their passage through Parliament. Leonard Jerome forced the principle into the contract through sheer stubbornness, a father reaching across the Atlantic to press a sliver of freedom into his daughter's hand before the door of the marriage closed behind her. It was, in its way, the most loving thing anyone did for Jennie in the whole arrangement, and it was done in the language of lawyers and capital sums. Jennie was, though no one used the phrase yet, one of the first of a wave. In the decades on either side of her wedding, a steady traffic ran across the Atlantic. The daughters of newly rich American families exchanged for the titles of cash-poor English ones, beauty and dollars on one side, blood and acres on the other. Dozens of great houses were kept standing through those years by American money married in, and the brides who brought it were often treated, once the check had cleared, as useful outsiders rather than as equals. Jennie was at the leading edge of that bargain, and she felt its condescension keenly. The difference was that she had no intention of being merely useful. She meant to conquer the world that had taken her father's money while looking down its nose at his name, and she had the weapons to do it. The young couple endured the haggling with mounting fury. Randolph, to prove his seriousness and to give himself a position, stood for Parliament, winning the family seat of Woodstock in the general election of 1874. He was now a member of Parliament with a future which softened the Duke a little. At last, the settlements were signed, the families gave their grudging blessing, and the wedding was fixed. It would not be at Blenheim, the vast Churchill palace, nor in a great London church with the Marlborough relations filling the pews. The Duke and Duchess would not attend at all. On the 15th of April, 1874, Jennie Jerome married Lord Randolph Churchill at the chapel of the British Embassy in Paris, the city of her girlhood. She was 20 years old. Her own parents were there, and the groom's brother stood up for him. But the great Marlborough dynasty stayed pointedly away, marking its disapproval to the last. Jennie did not seem to mind. She had got what she wanted in 3 days and held it through a year of opposition. She was Lady Randolph Churchill now, a daughter of Brooklyn, married into one of the first families of England. And she was carrying a secret that would set the whole machinery of gossip turning before the year was out. Chapter 3. A son born too soon. 7.5 months after the wedding, a child arrived at Blenheim Palace, and the counting started at once. On the 30th of November, 1874, in a small room off the Great Hall of the Churchill Palace at Woodstock, Jennie gave birth to a son. They named him Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. The official account was that the baby came early, brought on by a fall and a jolting carriage ride, and that may well be the simple truth. But 7.5 months was close enough to a full term to set every calculating mind in society to work, and the whispers that the child had been conceived before the wedding followed Jennie quietly for years. It was the first of many times that the world would do arithmetic about her body and reach a scandalous total. The boy who arrived that November night would, in the fullness of an extraordinary life, become the most important Englishman of the 20th century. But that was 70 years away, and unimaginable. For now, he was a baby handed almost at once to a nurse, as aristocratic babies were, and Jennie returned to the thing she had been built for, which was society. Motherhood in her world was conducted at a distance, through nannies and governesses and the occasional gracious appearance, and Jennie embraced that distance with an ease her son would feel as a wound for the rest of his childhood. His letters from school would beg her to visit, to write, to notice him. She loved him in her fashion, but her fashion kept its distance, and the small boy learned to adore a mother who was usually somewhere brilliant and elsewhere. It is tempting to judge her harshly for this, and easy to forget how completely the age made the distance for her. An aristocratic mother of the 1870s was not expected to raise her own children in any hands-on sense. The nursery had its nurse, the schoolroom its governess, and the boys were sent away to school at an age that would horrify a later century, 7 or 8 years old, packed off to board among strangers and to learn that tears were weakness. Winston's letters home, with their open longing for a mother who rarely came, were the letters half the boys of his class were writing into the same silence. Jennie did not invent the coldness. She inherited it, and she practiced it as her world expected. What makes the boy's later devotion so remarkable is that he forgave it entirely and turned the absent goddess of his childhood into the closest ally of his manhood. What drew her away was a world that had opened to her the moment she became Lady Randolph. The young Churchills were taken up, almost at once, by the fastest and most glamorous circle in England, the set that gathered around Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, the heir to Queen Victoria's throne. The prince liked beautiful women, clever talk, and people who could amuse him, and Jennie was all three at a level few could match. She could play the piano until grown men fell silent. She could hold a table of politicians and wits. She was, by universal account, the most arresting newcomer London had seen in years. The prince noticed her, and to be noticed by the prince was to be made. It is worth understanding what that circle was, because Jennie would live inside it for 30 years, and it would shape every chapter that follows. The Marlborough house set, named for the prince's London residence, was a few hundred people who had quietly agreed to live by rules different from the ones the rest of Victorian England preached. Below the surface of respectability, of family prayers and rigid propriety, the set conducted its affairs, its gambling, its enormous debts, and its discreet adulteries, protected by a code of silence and by the simple fact that the future king was at the centre of it. A married woman might take a lover, provided she was discreet, had first given her husband an heir, and never caused a public scene. It was a world made for someone like Jennie, and she moved into the heart of it with the confidence of a woman who had found her natural element at last. Set the scene in numbers, because the scale of it is part of the story. The Prince of Wales kept houses and a household that cost a fortune to run. The great hostesses of the set spent on entertaining what would today be hundreds of thousands of pounds in a single season, on dinners of a dozen courses, on house parties that ran for days, on the dresses and jewels without which a woman could not appear. Jennie, with her 1,000 a year of her own and her husband's income on top, was never as rich as the women she dined with, and she spent as though she were. Debt would shadow her entire life, the quiet undertow beneath the glittering surface, and it began here, in the first flush of her arrival, when the most exciting circle in England opened its doors, and she walked through without once looking at the cost. For a few short years, it was as close to a fairy tale as her life would come. She was young, beautiful, married to a rising man, and the favourite of a prince. Her husband's career was beginning to climb. The doors of every great house in London stood open. And then, in the spring of 1876, Randolph did something so reckless, so spectacularly ill-judged, that it slammed every one of those doors shut at once and sent the whole family into exile. The fairy tale was about to meet the first of its disasters, and it would come not from Jennie, but from the man she had married in 3 days. Chapter 4. The Prince and the Letters. To save his brother, Randolph reached for the most dangerous weapon in England and very nearly destroyed his own family with it. The trouble began with his elder brother, the Marquis of Blandford, who had embarked on an open affair with a married woman, Lady Aylesford, while her husband was away in India with the Prince of Wales. When Lord Aylesford learned of it and threatened divorce, the scandal threatened to drag the prince himself into a public courtroom, for the prince had been a friend and correspondent of Lady Aylesford and had encouraged the very social world in which such affairs flourished. Randolph, fiercely loyal to his brother and never able to resist a fight, decided to protect the family by force. He had got hold of letters the Prince of Wales had written to Lady Aylesford, letters indiscreet enough that their publication would have humiliated the heir to the throne. Randolph took them to the Princess of Wales, the prince's wife, and made the threat plain. If the Aylesford divorce went ahead and his brother was named, those letters would be made public, and the prince would never sit comfortably on the throne again. It was, in effect, an attempt to blackmail the future King of England, conducted by a young man not 3 years into his marriage, with his American wife and infant son at home. The prince's response was as total as it was predictable. He could not be seen to be threatened, and he made certain that the Churchills paid for the insult in the only currency that mattered in their world, which was social acceptance. The prince let it be known that he would not enter any house that received Lord and Lady Randolph Churchill. In a society organised entirely around who dined with whom, this was annihilation. Invitations stopped. Doors that had stood open swung shut. The brilliant young couple, the toast of the season barely 2 years earlier, became people no hostess dared to ask, for fear of offending the prince. Jennie, who had done nothing whatever to cause the quarrel, found herself frozen out of the only world she wanted to live in, punished for her husband's recklessness. To grasp how total a punishment that was, you have to understand that in this society, there was no life outside the invitations. A family's whole standing, its marriages, its sons' careers, its daughters' prospects, ran through the dinners and the house parties and the boxes at the opera, through the endless ranking of who was received and who was not. To be dropped by the Prince of Wales was not a private embarrassment that a couple could shrug off and carry on. It was a kind of civic death, a removal from the only arena that counted, and it touched everyone connected to them. The Duke of Marlborough himself, the head of the whole dynasty, felt the chill of it on his own position. A reckless threat made to protect one brother had endangered the standing of the entire house, and the house knew exactly whom to blame. The family's solution was a kind of honourable banishment. The 7th Duke of Marlborough was persuaded to accept the post of Viceroy of Ireland, the Crown's representative in Dublin, and he took Randolph with him as his private secretary. So in the winter of 1876, the young Churchills left London under a cloud and went to Ireland, where they would remain for the better part of 3 years. For Jennie it was exile in the fullest sense, removal from the centre of things to a provincial court across the sea, her wings clipped at the very moment she had learned to fly. And yet the Irish years, for all their disgrace, did something to her. Cut off from the glittering distractions of London, she threw herself into the life around her, hunting hard across the Irish countryside, an audacious and fearless rider who took fences that frightened the men. She read, she observed, she watched her father-in-law govern, and she began, for the first time, to take a serious interest in politics and in the machinery of power. The clever girl who had charmed drawing rooms started to become a woman who understood how the country was actually run. It was an education the London seasons would never have given her, bought at the price of 3 years in the cold. There was a second birth in these years too. In 1880, Jennie gave birth to a second son, John, always called Jack. He was a quieter, gentler boy than his fierce older brother, and he would grow up to live a respectable and largely private life in the city of London. But Jack arrived with a shadow over him that the gossips never quite let go. By the time of his birth, the marriage of Randolph and Jennie had cooled from its 3-day fever into something more like a partnership of convenience, and tongues in society murmured that Jack's father might not be Randolph at all. The names attached to the whisper varied. An earl here, a viscount there, and not a shred of it was ever proved. It belongs to gossip, not to record. But it was exactly the kind of whisper that followed Jennie everywhere, the world doing its arithmetic about her body once again, and reaching, once again, for the scandalous answer. By the end of the 1870s, the exile was ending. The prince's anger had cooled enough for a careful, negotiated reconciliation, and the Churchills were allowed back into the world that had cast them out. Jennie returned to London older, harder, cleverer, and more determined than the girl who had left it. The set that had frozen her out was waiting, and at its centre stood the man whose letters her husband had once tried to use as a weapon. The relationship between Jennie and the Prince of Wales was about to become the most talked about of her life. Chapter 5. The set that lived by other rules. There was a world inside the world, a few hundred people who answered to no one but a prince, and Jennie walked back into the centre of it. The reconciliation with the Prince of Wales, once achieved, was complete in the way these things were managed, and it carried Jennie to a height she had not reached before. To be received by the prince was one thing. To be sought out by him, invited to the intimate dinners, the country house parties, the inner gatherings of the Marlborough house set, was another, and Jennie was now among the small number of women the prince genuinely wanted at his table. Whatever had passed between her husband and the heir to the throne, it was Jennie the prince forgave, and Jennie he favoured. The exact nature of what grew between Jennie and Albert Edward is the question every account of her life must face, and honesty requires that it be faced carefully. That they were close over many years is beyond dispute. That she was one of his intimates, a fixture of his private circle, a woman to whom he wrote and whom he visited, is documented and certain. That the friendship became a love affair, that Jennie was for a time the mistress of the future Edward VII, is the firm and near universal belief of her biographers, repeated as established fact in book after book. But it rests on the testimony of a world that prized discretion above everything, that left few letters and fewer admissions, and it cannot be proved in the way a date or a settlement can be proved. The careful truth is this: the closeness is fact. The mistress is the strong claim of those who knew the set best, offered here as their verdict and not as a certainty. The prince himself is essential to understanding her, because his appetites set the weather for everyone around him. Albert Edward, kept idle for decades by a mother who would not let him near real power, had poured all his energy into pleasure, and he had made of his pleasure a kind of institution. He liked to eat enormously, to gamble, to shoot, and above all, to be entertained by beautiful and amusing women, a succession of whom held the title of royal favourite across the years. Lily Langtry, the actress and society beauty, had held it. Others held it before and after. There was nothing furtive about the pattern. It was understood, managed, and tolerated by a court that had decided the heir's contentment mattered more than the rules he broke. A woman who caught the prince's eye gained the whole weight of that institution at her back, and Jennie, clever and dazzling and game for his world, caught it thoroughly. Whatever exactly passed between them, she was one of the small number of women the future king wanted near him for 30 years. And in that society there was no surer foundation on which to stand. What can be said without hesitation is what the relationship gave her. The favour of the prince was the single most valuable asset a woman in that society could hold. It meant protection, position, the assurance that no hostess would dare to slight her, and no scandal could quite bring her down. It meant that when Randolph's career needed a door opened or a difficulty smoothed, Jennie had access to the most powerful private influence in the kingdom. She had turned the very quarrel that ruined them into the foundation of her recovery, and she had done it through her own charm, in her own person, at the heart of the prince's world. That world deserves to be seen plainly, because the gap between its surface and its conduct is the whole moral landscape of Jennie's life. To the public, the Marlborough House set was the pinnacle of respectable society, the glittering company of the heir to the throne. In private, it ran on a frank and managed immorality that the wider Victorian public, with its sermons and its decency, would have been horrified to see. Affairs were expected, provided they were discreet and came after the production of an heir. Husbands and wives took separate lovers by a kind of unspoken treaty. Enormous sums were lost at cards. Debts ran into figures that would ruin ordinary families. And over all of it lay a code of absolute silence. The understanding that what happened inside the set stayed inside it, and that the one unforgivable sin was not the affair, but the scandal, not the act, but the exposure. The scale of the spending alone tells the story. A great hostess might lay out for a single weekend house party what a labourer would not earn in 20 years. The women of the set changed their clothes 4 and 5 times a day, each costume worth a small fortune, and wore jewels valued at sums that could have bought streets of houses. The prince himself moved through this world trailing debts and devotions, the centre of a court that existed purely for pleasure, and that answered to no authority but his own whim. Into this, Jennie fitted as though she had been made for it, spending what she did not have, charming whom she chose, and accepting the protection of the most powerful man in the land. And here is the cruelty at the centre of her reputation, the thing the title of her story turns on. Jennie lived by exactly the rules the men around her lived by, the rules the Prince of Wales himself had written. She took lovers as the set permitted, discreetly, after she had given her husband 2 sons. She did precisely what was expected of a fashionable woman in that company, no more and no less than the men did, and a good deal less flagrantly than the prince. But she was a woman, and an American, and beautiful, and so the same conduct that made a man a charming rogue made her a scandal. The world counted her lovers where it would not have counted his. The double standard that would define her memory was not something she broke. It was something that was done to her. Chapter 6. The Chancellor at 37. For one dizzy year, the most talked about couple in Britain stood a single step from the very top of the government. Through the early 1880s, Randolph Churchill underwent a transformation as sudden and as dazzling as his courtship had been. The reckless young man who had blackmailed a prince reinvented himself as the most exciting politician in England. He gathered a small band of allies on the Conservative benches, a guerrilla group the press christened the Fourth Party, and from there he tormented the leaders of both sides with a wit and a daring that made him impossible to ignore. He coined a slogan, Tory democracy, the idea that the Conservative Party could be the party of the ordinary working man as well as the aristocrat. And he sold it from platforms across the country to crowds that had never cheered a Churchill before. Jennie was not a spectator in this. She was, by the accounts of everyone who watched the rise, a full partner in it. Her drawing room became one of the most important political salons in London, the place where alliances were made, where the right people were brought together over dinner, where her husband's career was advanced by the careful, ceaseless work of a brilliant hostess. She campaigned for him in the constituencies, a glamorous and tireless presence on the platform at a time when wives did not do such things. She read the papers, mastered the issues, judged the men, and gave Randolph the one thing a rising politician most needs and most rarely has: a clever and trusted ally who wanted nothing for herself but his success. The marriage that had cooled as a romance had become formidable as a machine. The work of that machine was relentless and almost invisible, which is exactly why it mattered. A political salon in the 1880s was not a frivolous thing. It was where the business of power was actually transacted, in the hours after the dinners and between the speeches, when the right men could be brought quietly together and persuaded and flattered and bound into alliance over the port and the candlelight. Jennie ran one of the best of these in London. She knew who hated whom, who could be useful, who was rising and who was finished, and she arranged her tables accordingly, placing a wavering ally beside the man who might win him over, drawing an editor into the orbit of the cause. She remembered every name and every grievance. She made Randolph's house the place ambitious men wanted to be seen, and she did it with a charm so complete that few of them noticed they were being managed. It was real political work, performed by a woman to whom the age would never have dreamed of giving a vote, let alone an office, and she was better at it than most of the men who held both. The climb was astonishingly fast. In the summer of 1886, after the Conservatives returned to power, Randolph Churchill was given two of the greatest offices in the state at once. At the age of 37, he became Chancellor of the Exchequer, in charge of the nation's finances, and leader of the House of Commons, in charge of the government's business in Parliament. He was, in effect, the second most powerful man in the country, and he was not yet 40. The obvious next step, the step everyone in politics assumed would come in time, was the office of Prime Minister itself. Jennie, the daughter of a Brooklyn speculator who had been frozen out of London a decade before, stood at the side of the man who seemed certain to lead Britain. The distance she had travelled is worth measuring. 12 years earlier, she had been an American newcomer with no name, married against the will of a duke who would not attend her wedding. Her father haggled down by the family lawyers as though she were a parcel of stock. Then had come the exile to Ireland, the cold years of disgrace, the slow climb back through the favour of a prince. And now she presided over the household of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the second figure in the government, in a London that had once shut its doors against her. The girl the great houses had treated as a bright vulgarity had made herself indispensable to the inner workings of British power, and she had done it without a vote, without an office, without a single one of the formal instruments of influence that the law reserved for men. She had done it with her own intelligence and charm, and she had every reason, in that golden season, to believe the climb would only continue. Picture the height of it. The Churchills now moved through a world that bent toward them. A Chancellor of the Exchequer commanded the attention of every banker, every editor, every ambitious member on his own benches. The great houses competed to have them. The Prince of Wales counted them among his intimates. Jennie's salon was the room where careers were made, and she was its presiding genius, beautiful, sharp, and at last fully in her element as a power in her own right and not merely an ornament. For a woman who had been told by the law of her adopted country that a wife owned nothing and was nothing apart from her husband, she had built something close to real influence, and she had built it out of charm, intelligence, and relentless work. It is important to feel how complete the triumph seemed because of what came next. Everything Jennie had endured, the year of haggling, the exile to Ireland, the cold years frozen out of society, had been redeemed. The gamble of marrying a clever, difficult man in 3 days appeared to have paid off beyond any reasonable hope. She was 32 years old, the wife of the coming Prime Minister, the favourite of the future king, the most celebrated hostess in the capital. The arithmetic of her life, for one brief season, came out entirely in her favour. And then her husband, who had risen by recklessness, fell by it. The same impulsiveness that had won him everything was about to lose it all, and faster than anyone could believe. Within months of reaching the summit, Randolph Churchill would throw it away in a single miscalculation, and the long descent that followed would carry him, and the woman tied to him, all the way down into a darkness that had a medical name no one would speak. Chapter 7. The Man She Truly Loved. Of all the names the gossips attached to her, only one belonged to a man she seems to have genuinely loved. His name was Count Karl Kinsky, and he was everything the age found dangerous and irresistible at once. He was an Austrian aristocrat of ancient family, a diplomat posted to the embassy in London, and one of the great horsemen of his generation. In 1883, he rode his own horse, Zoedone, to victory in the Grand National, the most punishing steeplechase in the world, the first amateur rider and the first foreign gentleman ever to win it. He was charming, daring, beautiful to look at, and some years younger than Jennie. When they came together, somewhere in the early 1880s, it became the central love of her life. The relationship with Kinsky stands apart from everything else the world said about her, and it is the place where the reputation and the reality finally meet. The 200 lovers of the legend, the figure that has followed her name for over a century, comes from a single source. It was set down by Anita Leslie, Jennie's own great-niece, in a biography written with the full cooperation of the Churchill family and published in 1969. And it was an estimate of a long and amorous life, not a counted list. Modern historians treat the number as the kind of round, startling figure that hardens into legend through repetition, and there is no ledger anywhere that could confirm it. The honest position is that Jennie took lovers, certainly more than one, across 30 years in a set that expected exactly that, and that the precise tally is unknowable and almost beside the point. What the legend obscures is that one of those attachments was not a fashionable affair at all. It was love. With Kinsky, Jennie seems to have wanted what her marriage could no longer give her. The accounts of those who knew her speak of a depth of feeling she showed for no one else. A hope, perhaps never quite spoken even to herself, that one day she might be free to be with him. For years, the relationship ran alongside her marriage, conducted with the discretion the set demanded, a source of joy and of private grief in equal measure. It is one of the quiet ironies of her life that the great romance and the great public partnership ran side by side, each invisible to the world that watched the other. To society, Jennie was the brilliant wife of the rising politician, the hostess whose tables made governments. To a smaller circle, she was a woman in love with a foreign count, hoping against the odds for a future the rules would never grant her. She held both lives at once, as the women of the set were expected to, keeping the surfaces smooth and the secrets deep. and the strain of that division must have been considerable even for a woman of her nerve. The love and the marriage made their claims on her in different rooms, and she answered both and told the truth of neither to the world. It was the price of admission to the only life she had been allowed to want, and she paid it for years without complaint, because the alternative was a respectability that would have bored her into the grave. He was the man she would have chosen, in a life that had let her choose. And the tragedy of her story is partly the tragedy of a woman who lived in an age that gave her everything except that one freedom. The other names the legend attaches to her deserve a word, handled with the same honesty. Across the years, the gossips linked Jennie to a long roll of men, some of them among the most powerful in Europe. There was talk of a son of the German Chancellor, of an American millionaire, of a Balkan king, of various officers and aristocrats whose names surfaced and sank in the drawing-room talk of the day. For most of these, the evidence is thin to vanishing. A rumour repeated until it sounded like fact, the same machinery of whisper that had once counted the months before Winston's birth and questioned the paternity of Jack. Some of the attachments were real, no doubt. The set she lived in expected them, and Jennie was not a woman to deny herself what the men around her took freely. But the difference between Kinsky and the rest is the difference between love and the fashionable conduct of a world that had made such conduct ordinary. The legend flattens all of it into a single scandalous number. The truth keeps the distinctions, and the most important distinction is that with one man, and as far as the record shows only one, Jennie wanted something the world would not let her have. It is worth pausing on what this reveals about the marriage itself. By the middle of the 1880s, Randolph and Jennie had become, in private, something closer to political partners than husband and wife. The passion of the 3-day courtship had long since burned out. They lived increasingly separate emotional lives by the quiet arrangement the set understood, even as they presented to the world the dazzling united front of the coming Prime Minister and his brilliant wife. She advanced his career with everything she had, and she gave her heart elsewhere. And in the world they inhabited, there was no contradiction in this that anyone troubled to name. But the arrangement depended on one thing, and that thing was about to be taken away. It depended on Randolph being well, being powerful, being the rising man whose career gave the marriage its purpose, and Jennie her position. As long as he climbed, the partnership held, and Jennie's private happiness with Kinsky could continue in its discreet channel beside it. The moment Randolph began to fall, the moment his health and his mind began to give way, everything would change. The separate lives would be forced back together by duty and by pity. And Jennie would be asked to make a choice between the man she had married in 3 days and the man she actually loved. A choice that would be put to her in the cruelest way imaginable, on the far side of the world, with the clock already running out. Chapter 8. The resignation that ended him. In December, he gambled his whole career on a single threat, certain he would win, and lost everything in a night. Randolph Churchill had reached the top by treating politics as a game of nerve, by pushing harder and further than his opponents dared, by making threats and watching the other man blink. At the end of 1886, only months into his great offices, he tried the tactic one time too many. As Chancellor of the Exchequer, he was drawing up his first budget, and he wanted deep cuts in spending, including cuts to the army and navy estimates that the service ministers refused to accept. Rather than negotiate, Randolph did what had always worked. He threatened to resign, certain that the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, could not afford to lose him and would give way. He sent his resignation to Salisbury, expecting it to be a weapon. Salisbury accepted it. There was no bluff to call, because Salisbury had quietly decided that the brilliant, ungovernable young Chancellor was more trouble inside the government than out of it, and he let him go without a fight. Randolph had reached for the threat that had carried him all the way up, and this time the ground was not there. In a single exchange of letters over the Christmas of 1886, he resigned the second most powerful position in the British government, and he never held office again. He was 37 years old, and his career, to all intents, was over the moment it should have been beginning. The suddenness of it stunned everyone, Jennie above all. One season she was the wife of the coming Prime Minister, presiding over the most important political salon in London. The next, she was married to a man who had thrown his future away in a fit of miscalculation, a former Chancellor with no office, no following, and a rapidly dwindling stock of goodwill. The machine she had helped to build, the partnership of charm and ambition that had carried them to the summit, had nothing left to drive. The career that had given her marriage its meaning was finished, and she was tied to its wreckage. What makes the blunder so painful is how needless it was. Randolph had not been forced out by a scandal or a defeat or a vote of his colleagues. He had simply overplayed a strong hand, mistaking his own importance for indispensability, and discovered too late that no man is as necessary as he believes. He had power, youth, talent, the favour of the public, and the second great office in the state. And he threw the lot away over a quarrel about figures that a wiser man would have settled across a desk in an afternoon. Jennie understood politics far too well not to see the size of the catastrophe at once. She had spent years building the very thing he had just destroyed in a fit of temper, and she could do nothing but watch. The hostess, whose tables had bound his alliances together, now presided over a house that the ambitious no longer needed to visit, and the slow, humiliating drift to the edges of the political world began, with her tied to a man who could not understand why the door had closed. For a while, Randolph tried to behave as though a return were possible, as though the wilderness were temporary and he would soon be recalled. It was not. The party had taken his measure, and the men he had tormented on his way up were in no hurry to help him back. He travelled. He tried to keep a hand in politics from the back benches. But the spark that had made him the most exciting man in the Commons was guttering, and those closest to him began to notice that the change in him was not only a matter of disappointment or temper. Something else was happening to Randolph Churchill, something in his speech, his memory, his moods, that frightened the people who loved him, and that they did not have the words or the permission to name. For Jennie, these were the years the bargain of her marriage curdled into pure duty. The partnership that had given her position was gone with the career that had defined it. The husband who had been her brilliant, difficult equal was becoming a man she had to watch, to manage, to protect from his own worsening conduct. And she had to do it while keeping up the appearances that her world demanded, smiling at the dinners, deflecting the questions, covering for the lapses that grew harder to explain. The clever, courted, ambitious woman of the salons found herself slowly turned into a nurse and a keeper, bound to a sinking man by a contract she had signed in 3 days of passion a lifetime before. She did not leave. Whatever the gossips said of her freedoms, she stayed, and she carried the weight of it, and she carried it largely alone, because the thing that was wrong with Randolph was the one thing no one in their world was permitted to say out loud. The fall from power, brutal as it was, would come to look almost merciful beside what followed. A man can recover from a political mistake. He can wait out a wilderness, rebuild a following, return in triumph a decade later, and history is full of those who did. Randolph would be given no such chance, because the thing that was destroying him was not in the House of Commons or the Conservative Party. It was in his own body, and it had been there, quietly, for years, and it was now beginning to surface in ways that could no longer be hidden. The resignation had ended his career. The disease was about to end his life, and to do it slowly, in public, in front of the wife who could not look away. Chapter 9. The Illness with No Name. Long before the end, the people closest to him knew that something was eating his mind, and they knew they could never say what. Through the late 1880s and into the 1890s, the decline of Randolph Churchill became impossible to ignore and impossible to discuss. His speech began to slur. His moods swung from black depression to wild, grandiose excitement. He grew paranoid, suspicious of friends, certain of insults that had not been given. His hands trembled. His walk became unsteady. In the House of Commons, where he had once held the whole chamber spellbound, he now rose to deliver speeches that rambled and faltered, and members who had cheered him looked away in embarrassment and pity. The most brilliant talker of his generation was losing the use of the one instrument that had made him, his own mind. There was a particular cruelty in the way the disease chose its target. Randolph Churchill had been, above all else, a man of words, a speaker who could hold the House of Commons in the palm of his hand, whose wit and timing and command of language had carried him from obscurity to the heights in a handful of years. The illness took precisely that. It went after the speech, the memory, the judgment, the very faculties on which his whole identity had been built, and it dismantled them in front of an audience that had once hung on his every sentence. Friends who had feared his tongue now winced at his ramblings. The newspapers that had quoted him began, gently and then less gently, to note that he was not himself. To watch a great speaker lose his words is a peculiar kind of public death, and Randolph died it slowly, in the most public arena in the country, while his wife sat in the gallery, and the family did everything in its power to pretend that nothing was wrong. His doctors, Robson Roos and the eminent Sir Richard Quain, watched the progression with the grim recognition of men who had seen it before. The diagnosis they recorded was general paralysis of the insane, the medical name of the period for the final stage of a disease that everyone understood and no one would name in polite company. The disease was syphilis in its last neurological phase, attacking the brain after lying dormant for years. It was the secret plague of the Victorian governing class, contracted in youth and carried silently for decades, and it could not be spoken of, least of all in connection with the husband of Lady Randolph Churchill and the father of a rising young man named Winston. The family knew. The doctors knew. And the word was never said aloud. The disease was everywhere in that world, and nowhere in its conversation. Beneath the starched respectability of Victorian England ran a vast, unspoken epidemic, the consequence of an age that confined respectable women, kept marriage late for men, and tolerated a huge trade in prostitution in every great city while preaching purity from every pulpit. Men of Randolph's class sowed in their youth what could ripen, decades later, into madness and paralysis, and the medical profession had a whole vocabulary of soft euphemism to keep the truth decently veiled. A man did not have syphilis. He suffered from general paralysis, or from nervous exhaustion, or from a softening of the brain. The veil protected the family, protected the name, protected the comfortable belief that such things happened only to the poor and the vicious. Behind it, in the best houses in the land, brilliant men went quietly out of their minds, and their wives nursed them and held their tongues, and the world agreed to look the other way. Honesty requires a careful note here, because the diagnosis has been argued over ever since. The contemporary doctors, the men who actually examined him, were close to unanimous that this was neurosyphilis, and the principal biographers of the Churchill family have accepted their verdict. But a strand of modern medical opinion has challenged it, suggesting that the pattern of his symptoms might fit a deep tumour of the brain rather than syphilis, and that general paralysis was a label sometimes applied loosely in that era. The mainstream of historical opinion still holds to the original diagnosis. The revision exists and deserves to be acknowledged. What is not in doubt, on any reading, is that Randolph Churchill was dying by inches of something that destroyed his mind before it took his body, and that his wife watched every stage of it. And here, the cruelest knot of Jennie's whole story pulls tight. If the diagnosis was right, then the disease that was killing her husband was a disease of sexual contact, and the world that whispered about her 200 lovers could not fail to draw its own ugly conclusions about a marriage in which the husband was rotting from such a cause. It must be said as plainly as possible. There is no evidence whatever that Jennie infected Randolph. The standard account is that he carried the disease from before or near the beginning of the marriage, contracted in his own youth, and the lurid stories of how and from whom belong entirely to legend. The terrible irony the title of her story leans on is just that, an irony, the spectacle of a woman counted by her lovers nursing a husband killed by a disease of the flesh. It is not a charge against her. It is the unbearable shape her life happened to take. Whatever the medical truth, the human truth was a slow horror. For years, Jennie lived with a husband who was becoming a stranger, whose tenderness gave way to suspicion, whose brilliance dissolved into confusion, who needed care she had never been raised to give and could not refuse to give. The glamorous partnership was gone. The political salon was gone. In its place was a sick room and a famous, beautiful woman tied to the long, ugly, unspeakable dying of the man she had married in 3 days. And then, near the end, when she might have stayed home and let the illness take its course in private, she agreed instead to take him around the world on a journey that would become the strangest and saddest passage of her life. Chapter 10. A voyage to watch him die. She agreed to take her dying husband around the world, and somewhere over the ocean she learned she had lost the other man too. In the middle of 1894, with Randolph visibly failing, his doctors and his family settled on a desperate plan. He would undertake a long voyage around the world, a journey of many months through Asia and the Americas, in the hope that travel and rest might slow the disease, or at least give him an end away from the prying eyes of London. Jennie would go with him. It was an extraordinary thing to ask of her, to shut herself up for the better part of a year in cabins and hotels with a husband whose mind was disintegrating, far from her friends, her sons, and the world she lived for. She agreed, and she went. The voyage was an ordeal that the surviving letters only partly capture. Randolph's condition worsened steadily as they travelled. His behaviour became more erratic and more difficult, the swings of mood more violent, the lucid intervals shorter. Jennie nursed him through it, managed him, covered for him, made the arrangements, and absorbed the daily strain of caring for a man who was no longer fully himself, and who could be cruel and bewildered by turns. They were thousands of miles from home, moving from port to port, and the burden of it fell almost entirely on her. Whatever the world believed about the frivolous, much-courted Lady Randolph, the truth of these months was a woman doing the hardest and least glamorous work there is, the work of watching someone die slowly and not being able to stop it. The practical reality of the journey is worth dwelling on because it strips the glamour from the legend entirely. This was not a comfortable modern voyage with doctors and nurses on call. It was months of travel by ship and train through Asia and across the Pacific in the 1890s, with a patient whose brain was failing and whose conduct grew more unpredictable by the week. There were long sea passages and strange hotels, the constant work of packing and moving and managing, the embarrassment of a famous man behaving strangely in public, the fear of what each new day would bring. Randolph carried, on the doctor's orders, the means of a dignified end should the disease reach its worst stages far from home, and Jennie travelled in the shadow of that knowledge. She wrote letters home that tried to keep up a brave front and could not quite hide the strain beneath. She was thousands of miles from her sons, from her friends, from the man she loved, alone with a husband who was disappearing in front of her, and she kept going, day after day, because there was no one else to do it and nowhere to set the burden down. And it was during this voyage, while she was locked into the long duty of her husband's dying, that the other blow fell. Word reached her, somewhere on the far side of the world, that Count Kinsky, the man she truly loved, the man she had perhaps allowed herself to imagine a future with, had become engaged to another woman. She was a young Austrian countess, many years Jennie's junior, and the engagement was real and final. The timing of it is almost too cruel to credit. At the exact moment Jennie was chained by duty to a dying husband, unable to act, unable to return, the one door she had quietly kept open in her heart was closed for good, and by the man himself. She could do nothing but read the news and go on nursing Randolph through the next bad night. Sit with the shape of that for a moment, because it is the emotional centre of her whole life. She had given up her freedom to marry Randolph in 3 days. She had given up the man she loved to the demands of discretion and circumstance. And now, at the lowest point of all, she was made to give up even the hope of him, while performing the most thankless duty a wife could be asked to perform, with no reward in it and no end in sight but a grave. The woman the gossips painted as a creature of appetite and selfishness was in these months as trapped and as faithful to a hard obligation as any wife in England. The legend and the reality had never stood further apart than they did on that ship. The voyage could not save Randolph, and it was never really going to. As the year turned and his condition collapsed beyond any pretense of recovery, the decision was made to bring him home to England to die. They returned at the end of 1894, Randolph by now reduced to a shadow of the man who had nearly led the country, his mind almost gone, his body failing fast. Jennie had taken her husband around the world and brought him back to die in the house where it had all begun. The end, when it came, would come quickly now, and it would set her free into a widowhood that was both a release and a kind of sentence of its own. Chapter 11. The Widow at 41. When it was finally over, she was free in a way she had never been, and ruined in a way no freedom could fix. Randolph Churchill died on the 24th of January 1895 at his mother's house in London, with Jennie near him. He was 45 years old. The man who at 37 had held 2 of the great offices of state and seemed certain to be Prime Minister, had spent his last years sliding into madness and silence. And he died a wreck of his former self, mourned more for what he had been than for what he had become. The funeral was held at the little church at Bladen, near Blenheim, where the Churchills were buried. And there in the Oxfordshire churchyard, the most exciting politician of his generation was laid in the ground at the age of 45. For Jennie, the death was a complicated kind of liberation, and it is to her credit that she never pretended otherwise to those close to her. She was 41 years old, a widow, still beautiful, still magnetic, and for the first time in her adult life, she belonged to no one. The marriage that had begun in 3 days of passion and cooled into duty and ended in the long horror of the sick room was over. The years of nursing were behind her. She was, at last, her own woman, free to live as she chose. But the freedom came stripped of the things that had made her position: the rising husband, the political partnership, the role at the center of power. She was a widow with 2 grown sons, a tangle of debts, and a reputation that 30 years in the Marlborough house set had fixed beyond changing. That reputation was the cage that freedom could not open. By 1895, Jennie Jerome was a legend in the worst sense, the beautiful American who had married into the Churchills and lived exactly as boldly as the men around her, and the world had long since decided what to make of her. The same conduct that had passed unremarked in the Prince of Wales made Jennie a byword. The lovers, real and imagined, had been totted up. The whispers about Jack's paternity, about the favour of the prince, about the men who came and went, had hardened into a settled story that no widowhood could soften. She had spent her freedom before she ever had it, in the only way her world allowed a woman to spend anything, and the bill had come due. The money, as ever, made the freedom harder still. Randolph left no great fortune, and the debts that had trailed the couple for 20 years did not die with him. Jennie was a widow of expensive habits and uncertain income, with 2 sons to launch into the world on a scale befitting their name and no obvious means of paying for it. Winston was at the start of his career and hungry for money to fund his ambitions. Jack would need establishing. And Jennie herself had never in her life learned to live within her means, nor did she intend to start now. The $1,000 a year her father had fought to secure for her was a thread of independence, but it was nothing against the style she required, and so the rest of her life would be a long, ingenious, exhausting campaign to raise money through schemes and loans and ventures to fund a manner of living she could not afford and would not give up. The widow at 41 was free, and she was also, in the most ordinary and grinding way, in trouble. There is a deep injustice at the heart of this, and her story exists partly to name it. Jennie had broken no rule that the men of her world had not broken first and broken worse. She had been a faithful nurse to a dying husband, a tireless ally to his career, a devoted, if distant, mother to 2 sons. She had real gifts, the musical talent, the intelligence, the energy that might have built a dozen careers had she been born a man or born later. And the sum the world made of her was scandal. She had been denied a profession. She had been denied the man she loved. She had been denied, in the end, even the right to be remembered for anything but the men whose names were attached to hers. The arithmetic of her life, which had come out so brilliantly for one short season, had come out, in the end, against her. And yet the remarkable thing about Jennie Jerome is what she did with the wreckage. A lesser woman, widowed at 41 with a ruined name and mounting debts, might have retired into respectable shadow and let the world forget her. Jennie did the opposite. She was about to begin the strangest and in some ways the bravest chapter of her life, a long second act of reinvention, scandal, and defiant refusal to grow old quietly, in which she would marry men young enough to be her sons, found a magazine, fit out a hospital ship, and watch the neglected boy from the nursery rise to a fame that would eclipse anything his father had dreamed. The widow was not finished. She was barely halfway through. Chapter 12. The boy who became her partner. The neglected child of the nursery grew into the one man who would never leave her, and together they went to work. The relationship between Jennie and her elder son had been, through his childhood, a study in distant adoration. Winston had worshipped his glamorous, absent mother from the cold of his boarding schools, filling his letters with pleas for her attention, and she had given it sparingly, in the manner of her class and her time. But as Winston grew into a young man of ferocious ambition, something changed between them. and the distance closed into one of the most effective partnerships of her life. She threw herself into advancing his career with the same energy she had once spent on his father, pulling strings, opening doors, pressing her contacts in politics and the press to give her brilliant, impatient son his chance. He later wrote that in those years she was less like a mother to him than like an ally, working in the closest concert with him, more like a sister than a parent. The neglect of the nursery had somehow turned, in adulthood, into a genuine alliance of equals. The help she gave him was concrete, and it came at the moments that mattered most. When the young Winston wanted a posting to a war so that he could win the reputation that opens doors, it was Jennie who worked her contacts, wrote to the right generals, and pulled the strings that got him there. When he came home with his dispatches and his ambition and wanted them published and noticed, it was Jennie who knew the editors and the proprietors and pressed his cause among them. She used the whole accumulated capital of 30 years in society, every favour, every friendship, every door her beauty and her wit had opened, and she spent it, without hesitation, on her son. He was the great project of her later life, and she advanced him with the same relentless skill she had once spent on his father, with the difference that this time the investment would repay the world 1,000 times over. The boy she had loved from a distance became the man she worked beside, and the partnership of mother and son was, by the end, one of the few unqualified successes of her life. While she built up her son, Jennie astonished London by refusing to settle into dignified widowhood. In 1900, at the age of 45, she married again, and her choice was a scandal in itself. George Cornwallis West was a handsome young officer of the Scots Guards, 20 years her junior, born in the same year as Winston himself. A famous widow marrying a man the same age as her own son was precisely the kind of thing the world loved to be appalled by, and it was appalled with enthusiasm. The marriage was a strain almost from the start, dogged by money troubles and by the awkwardness of his position, and it would not last. But it announced something important about Jennie. She had no intention of being told by anyone, least of all by society, how a woman of her age was permitted to live and whom she was permitted to love. She poured her restless energy into ventures that few women of her time would have dared. She founded and edited a lavish literary magazine, a quarterly bound like a rare antique book, and so expensive to produce that it could never pay its way, filled with writing by the leading authors of the day. It was extravagant, beautiful, and a financial folly, and it was entirely Jennie, a woman who had to create, to produce, to make something of herself in a world that gave her no proper outlet. She wrote her own memoirs. She tried her hand at writing plays and saw one of them staged. None of it made her secure, and her debts ran on beneath everything as they always had. But it was the work of a woman who refused to be merely decorative, reaching, in the only ways open to her, for something more. And when war came, she reached further still. During the South African War at the turn of the century, Jennie threw herself into organizing an American-funded hospital ship to carry the wounded, the vessel named the Maine, raising the money, fitting it out, and seeing it sent to the front. Years later, when the far greater catastrophe of the First World War engulfed Europe, she would turn her energies to war work again. The woman the gossips had counted by her lovers had a record of practical, demanding, useful service that the legend left almost entirely out. It was easier to remember the scandal than the hospital ship. It usually is. Through all of it, Winston rose. The neglected boy became a soldier, a war correspondent, a celebrated escape from captivity, a member of parliament, a minister. Jennie lived to see the first long climb of the man who would one day stand alone against the darkness and save his country. and she had a real hand in that climb, the door opener, the string puller, the ally of his hungry youth. Whatever the world said of her, she had given the 20th century its most important Englishman, and then helped to make him. It is not the smallest thing a life can do. Chapter 13. Married for the third time. At 64, divorced and short of money, she did the one thing the world was sure she was too old to do again. The marriage to George Cornwallis West, strained by money and by the impossible arithmetic of their ages, came apart in 1914, and they divorced. He went on to marry a famous actress. Jennie, now in her late 50s, found herself once more alone, once more short of money, and once more entirely unwilling to accept that her life of love and incident was behind her. Society, which had never stopped watching her, assumed that this time, surely, the great Lady Randolph would subside into the quiet of old age. Society had never understood her. In 1918, at the age of 64, Jennie married for the third time. Her new husband was Montague Porch, a member of the British colonial service in Nigeria, and he was 23 years younger than she was, younger even than her sons. The world reacted with the mixture of horror and helpless admiration that Jennie had been provoking for half a century. A woman of 64 marrying a man in his early 40s, a woman who had outlived 2 marriages and a generation of scandal, was not supposed to be possible. Jennie simply went ahead and did it, and by the accounts that survive, the late marriage was a genuinely affectionate one, a source of real happiness in her last years. She had spent her whole life refusing to be told what a woman could do, and she refused it to the very end. The reaction to the match tells you as much about the world as about Jennie. A man of 64 who married a woman of 40 would have drawn no comment at all. It was the everyday arrangement of the age, the older man and the younger wife, and no one thought to call it scandalous. Reverse the ages, set a woman of 64 beside a husband in his early 40s, and the same world that shrugged at the one recoiled at the other. The double standard that had counted her lovers and forgiven the prince his was at work again, in old age as in youth, insisting that a woman past a certain year had no business with desire or companionship or a young man's arm. Jennie met it the way she had met every other version of that standard across her life. She ignored it entirely, married the man she wanted, and let the disapproving talk wash over her as it always had. The talk would stop. She would not. It would be wrong to paint these final years as untroubled. The money problems that had shadowed her from the first season in London never released their grip. She had spent her whole life beyond her means, on magazines that lost fortunes, on houses and clothes and travel, on the style without which she did not feel herself to be alive, and the debts followed her into old age. She leaned on loans, on the help of her sons, on her own ceaseless schemes to raise money, and she never achieved the security that a more cautious woman might have built. But caution had never been the point of Jennie Jerome. She had decided, somewhere very early, that a life was for living at full stretch, and she paid the running costs of that decision until the day she died. There is something almost heroic in the refusal, when you set it against the alternative the age offered her. A widow of her years was expected to fold herself away into a decent, diminished half-life, to dress in subdued colours, to surrender the field to younger women, to become an aunt and a dowager and a memory. Jennie declined the whole arrangement. She married for love and for company when it suited her, regardless of the arithmetic of ages. She founded things and wrote things and fitted out ships and threw herself at every project that promised to keep her fully alive. She was, in the language of a much later time, refusing to disappear, insisting that a woman did not stop being a person of appetite and ambition simply because the calendar said she should. The world found it scandalous and called her vain and shook its head. It mistook for foolishness what was really a kind of courage, the courage to keep living loudly in a society that wanted its older women silent. What is striking, looking back across the whole arc, is how little the essential woman changed. The girl who had married in 3 days against the will of 2 families was the same woman who married a man half her age at 64 against the judgment of all society. The American who had walked into London with a snake tattooed on her wrist and a refusal to apologize for anything was, 50 years on, still refusing. Age had not made her safe or quiet or conventional. It had only given the world longer to disapprove, and given Jennie longer to ignore the disapproval. She remained, to the end, exactly what Lord Dabernon had seen all those years before. More of the panther than of the woman. More of the cat than of the lady. She had a young husband to please now, and pleasing him was the kind of small vanity she had never been able to resist. And so, in the summer of 1921, Jennie did a thing so ordinary and so trivial that no one could have imagined it would kill her. She bought a new pair of shoes. They were fashionable shoes, with high heels, bought to look well for a husband young enough to be her son. And it was those shoes, and a staircase in a country house, that brought the long, defiant, scandalous life of Jennie Jerome to its sudden and almost unbearable end. Chapter 14. The High Heels and the Staircase. In the end, it was a pair of new shoes, bought to please a young husband, that killed the most courted woman of her age. In June of 1921, Jennie was staying with a friend, Lady Frances Horner, at Mells in Somerset. Coming down a staircase in the new high-heeled shoes she had bought to look well for Montague Porch, she slipped and fell, and the fall broke her leg. It was the kind of accident that should have meant some weeks of discomfort and recovery, no more. But the injury did not heal as it should. Gangrene set into the leg, the tissue dying and the infection spreading, and within a fortnight, her doctors faced the only choice left to them. To save her life, the leg would have to come off. The detail that her biographers have never been able to let go of belongs to this moment, because it is Jennie entire. As the surgeons prepared to amputate her gangrenous leg above the knee, she did not weep or flinch or beg. She gave the surgeon an instruction. "Make sure," she told him, "that you cut high enough." Conscious, composed, facing the loss of her own leg, she was thinking clearly about the spread of the infection and the margin of safety, and she said so. It is the coolness of the woman who had taken Irish fences that frightened the men, who had nursed a dying husband around the world, who had married against the judgment of all society 3 times over. Even here, even now, she was unafraid, and she was in command of the room. The amputation was done, and for a few days it seemed that her astonishing nerve had carried her through once more, that she was recovering, that she would live. Then, on the morning of the 29th of June, 1921, the great artery in the stump of the amputated leg suddenly burst. She bled and fell into a coma, and before her sons could reach her, she died. She was 67 years old, the most arresting woman of her age, the American who had unsettled London and bewitched a prince and outlived every rule the world had tried to bind her with, was gone in a few minutes, undone by a pair of fashionable shoes and a flight of stairs. They buried her at Blaydon, in the Oxfordshire churchyard where Randolph already lay. The husband she had married in 3 days and nursed to his death across the far side of the world. The 2 of them rest there still, side by side, and one day a 3rd grave would join them in that same small churchyard, for it is at Blaydon that Winston Churchill himself was buried in 1965. The neglected boy from the nursery, come home at last, to lie near the mother who had been more like a sister to him. The American girl who had been frozen out of London society lies now in the most quietly famous churchyard in England, between the husband whose disease she nursed and the son who saved the world. What remains, when the counting is done, is not the number the legend gave her. The 200 lovers were an estimate set down by a loving great-niece and swollen by 100 years of repetition, and they were never the truth of her. The truth of her was harder and finer than the scandal. She was a woman of real gifts, the musician, the writer, the political partner, the organizer of hospital ships, born into a world that allowed a clever woman no honest use for any of it but charm. She lived by the rules the men around her had written, the rules of the prince's own set, and she was condemned for keeping them while the men were forgiven. She was denied a profession, denied the man she loved, and denied, at the last, even the right to be remembered for anything but the men whose names were tied to hers. Lord Dabernon, who had watched her cross a room a lifetime before, had written that there was more of the panther than of the woman in her, more of the cat than of the lady, a wild thing moving through a tame world. He meant it as a description of her beauty. It reads better now as a description of her whole life, a creature too vivid and too free for the cage she was born into, admired and feared, and finally reduced, in the public memory, to the scandal she could not help but cause, simply by living at full stretch. Under the diamonds on her wrist, she had worn, all her life, the small coiled snake, the private mark beneath the public jewel. The world saw the diamonds and called her a scandal. It never quite troubled to look at the woman underneath. That was always the real story, and it was the one they chose to forget. If this story stayed with you, then subscribe and stay for the other lives the official histories tidy away into a single scandalous line. And tell me below, do you think Jennie Jerome was a scandal? Or simply a woman who lived by the same rules as the men around her and was punished for it? Let me know where you are watching from and what you make of her.